Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Shabbat. We're up to Perek Gimel Mishnah Vav. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aran Bayev, Neriyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. This Mishnah discusses the laws of Muktzeh that apply to the oil of a lamp and to the lamp itself. Muktzeh, literally set aside, refers to anything that may not be moved on Shabbat. We will discuss B'ezrat Hashem at a later time the different categories of Muktzeh, of items that cannot be moved on Shabbat. But to explain the Mishnah, in the times of the Mishnah, oil lamps were used to provide light. They were earthenware cup-like vessels filled with oil, with the wick extending from a spout on one side. So the Mishnah says, "En notnin kli tzachat haner lekabel bo et hashemen." We may not place a utensil, such as a plate, under a lamp on Shabbat in order to catch the dripping oil in it, because the oil, which is muktzeh, will make the plate muktzeh. Now the Mefarshim explain, the oil itself is muktzeh, it's set aside, it cannot be moved, because it was set aside for the mitzvah of fueling the lamp for Shabbat, muktzeh the mitzvato, and because it cannot be used for anything else without violating the melacha of extinguishing, so it's muktzeh machmat isur. Now when the oil drips into the plate becomes muktzeh because it now serves as a base for the muktzeh oils. As a result, the plate can no longer be used for any other purpose. Now we know canceling a utensil's usefulness, which is bitul kli mechano, by causing it to become muktzeh and unmovable, is prohibited by the rabbis because it's like cementing a utensil in place, which is the melacha boneh, building. Therefore, you cannot place a utensil under it to catch a dripping oil. But if it was placed there while it is still day, meaning before Shabbat begins, we are allowed to leave it there to catch the oil on Shabbat, since the person is not doing anything on Shabbat itself. But even if he placed a utensil under the lamp before Shabbat began, we may not derive benefit from the oil on Shabbat because the oil is not prepared, meaning it is muktzeh. Now, when the oil was set aside and used to fuel the Shabbat lamp, it became both muktzeh mitzvato, set aside for its mitzvah, and muktzeh machmat isur, muktzeh on account of its prohibition, because you can't use it unless you extinguish it, and you can't extinguish the lamp. It may therefore not be used for any other purpose. And we also know removing oil from a lit lamp itself is also a transgression of the melacha of mechabeh, extinguishing. Now the Mishnah discusses the muktzeh status of unlit lamps. Mitaltilin ner chadash v'lo yashan. We may move a new, never used lamp on Shabbat, but not an old one, which had already been used, because it has become grimy and repulsive and therefore muktzeh. The Mefarshim explain, a new earthenware lamp that has not yet held any oil is not grimy and is still fit to be used for purposes other than lighting. So for example, to store small items. Therefore, it's not muktzeh and may be handled on Shabbat. But once the lamp was used with oil, it becomes grimy and is no longer fit for other purposes, and therefore it becomes muktzeh machman mius, muktzeh on account of disgust, and may not be handled on Shabbat even when it is not lit. Rabbi Shimon Omer, but Rabbi Shimon says, Kol hanerot metaltilin chutz min haner adolek b'Shabbat. We may move all types of lamps on Shabbat, even used ones, except for a lamp that is burning on Shabbat, because the lamp is considered a base for the flame and is therefore muktzeh. Now the Rav explains, Rabbi Shimon holds that there's no isur, no prohibition of muktzeh machman mius, muktzeh on account of disgust. Therefore, there's no reason to prohibit a used lamp. However, Rabbi Shimon agrees that a basis ledavar asur, a base to a muktzeh object, is considered muktzeh. So if so, when the lamp is burning, the lamp, the oil, and the wick all become a base for the muktzeh flame, and so they are also muktzeh and they may not be moved, as the Gemara says on page 47a, Masechet Shabbat. Now, a flame or a spark is muktzeh machmat gufo, muktzeh on account of its own nature, because it itself is not a utensil or food, like we will see when we explain the categories. Now, the Rav says, "Ven elecha ki Rabbi Shimon shematir letaltel kol hanerot chutz min haner adolek." The halacha does not follow Rabbi Shimon, who permits you to move all lamps except for when they are lit, because the halacha, the Rav explains, is really shener sheidliku leleilei Shabbat, candles, lamps that were lit on Friday afternoon for Shabbat, af al pi shekiba, even though it already extinguished, asur letaltelo kol oto Shabbat. You may no longer move that lamp the entire Shabbat, unlike Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said only when it's actually lit. Why? Because it was a gzera shemi. You might come to extinguish it, but when it's already extinguished, Rabbi Shimon allowed you to move it. But he says that the Rab says the halacha is that even when it becomes extinguished, you can no longer move it. Since it was muktzeh at the time when Shabbat came in, it stays muktzeh for the entire Shabbat. But all other lamps, we follow Rabbi Shimon, that really the only time we wouldn't allow you to move the lamp is obviously when it's lit, and also if you had lit it, but if it was a lamp that was not lit for the Shabbat, if it's not an expensive lamp, the Rav writes you'd be allowed to move it only when it would be muktzah machman cheson kis, it would be set aside due to its high value. That case, Modeh Rabbi Shimon would agree that you're not allowed to move it. But generally, by other nerot, other lamps that were not lit to Shabbat, the Rav says that we would follow Rabbi Shimon, but we do not follow Rabbi Shimon in a case of a lamp that was lit for the Shabbat became extinguished. That we cannot move since it was muktzah on Friday afternoon. It says muktzah throughout the entire Shabbat. The Mishnah gives an additional law about a lamp that's burning on Shabbat. We may place a utensil under a lit lamp on Shabbat in order to catch the falling sparks and prevent the fire, which the Mefarshim explain. Although the sparks, like a flame, are muktzah on account of their own nature, the utensil they land in does not become a base for them, because once a spark burns out, the burnt matter that remains is too insignificant to render the utensil forbidden as its base. But we may not place water in the utensil even before Shabbat begins, because we are thereby extinguishing the sparks. When someone pours water into a utensil on Shabbat while the sparks are falling, he is considered to be actively performing the melachav mechabe, extinguishing. So the rabbis prohibited pouring water into the utensil even before Shabbat, lest someone do so on Shabbat itself. And on Shabbat itself, obviously, it would be considered mechabeh if you would be pouring water while the sparks were falling. And that is in Rabotai of Perek Gimel, Mishnah Vav. We begin now Perek Daled, Mishnah Aleph. Now, as an introduction, the sages prohibited keeping food hot for Shabbat by completely surrounding a pot with any substance that adds heat. Mosif Haval, right? Adds heat. That would be asur. This is forbidden, the Mefarshim say, even though it's done on Erev Shabbat, on Friday afternoon, if the pot is then left insulated on Shabbat. Because if it were permissible to surround food with a substance that adds heat, this might lead people to bury their pots in hot ash containing glowing embers, and that in turn is prohibited because one might stir the embers in order to make them hotter, which would be transgressing the melacha of lighting a fire. It is permissible to insulate a pot of food before Shabbat if the substance used to insulate the pot only preserves the food's heat, right? Shomer chomo, but does not make it hotter. So Mishnah now discusses which materials may be used and which may not be used. What's called preserving and what's adding. Bamed tomnin, with what materials may we surround a pot of food on Erev Shabbat to insulate it and keep it warm for Shabbat? Ubama en tomnin, and with what materials may we not surround the pot? Meaning, which materials add heat and are therefore forbidden, and which merely maintain the food's heat and are therefore permitted. En tomnin lo begefet velo bezevel. We may not surround pots with olive or sesame pulp, nor with manure. And the Rav explains, when olive or sesame pulp is packed together, it becomes extremely hot. Lo bemelach velo besid velo bechol. Nor may we surround pots either with salt, lime, or sand, because these substances all add heat. Ben lachim, ben yivashim. These substances may not be used whether they are moist or dry, because they add heat even when they are dry. Now, although these substances generate more heat when they're moist, nevertheless, even when dry, they add some heat to the food and therefore may not be used. Lo b'teben belo b'zagim. We may not surround food to insulate it with straw, nor with grape skins. Velo b'mochim, velo b'asavim, nor with pieces of soft, unprocessed material, such as strips of wool or pieces of worn clothing, nor with grass. Bizman shen lachim. However, it's only when these substances are still moist. Aval tomnin b'en kishen levishin. But we may surround food with these substances when they are dry, because these substances add heat only when they are moist. Now, the Mefarshim explained the Mishnah prohibits insulating food with these substances only if they still retain some of their original natural moisture. The last category that we said, the straw, grape skins, soft, unprocessed material, right? Now, if the substance had dried off and then became moist again, it still may be used for insulating food. It's only when they retain some of their original natural moisture. Now, even pieces of wool or worn clothing can be naturally moist if they come from an area of the animal's body that absorbed a great deal of perspiration. That's what the Mephoshim explained, that it has natural moisture. Such fabric is heavy with lanolin, a natural oil found in wool. Now, wool from these areas can sometimes retain moisture. They can remain moist even after it has been woven into a garment, which is why the Mephoshim explained. The Mishnah brings it down. The Mishnah continues, Tomin b'chsut u'perot. We may surround a pot of food to insulate it with clothing or with produce like grain or beans that are small enough to be used to insulate food. Bechanfei yona uvinsoret shel charashim uvinoret shel pishtan daka, as well as with pigeon feathers or with sawdust or with fine flax combings, meaning the splinters that fall from flax as it's combed out. For these substances these substances all do not add heat. And the Mephoshim explained, when we said pigeon feathers, really any type of feathers may be used for wrapping food. The Mishnah is using the example of pigeon feathers because it was common to use those. Now, the Mephoshim also explain flax fibers grow inside the woody stalk of the plant. The stalk is soaked and then beaten to break down the woody part. The flax is then combed to remove the woody splinters from the flax fibers. So these fine flax combings, meaning the splinters that fall from the flax that is combed, you can use that. They do not add heat. Rabbi Yehuda sab badaka, but Rabbi Yehuda forbids surrounding a pot with fine flax combings because they do produce some heat. Umatil begasa, and permits only coarse combings, which the Rav explains. Rabbi Yehuda forbids only fine flax combings. He agrees that sawdust may be used, whether it is coarse or fine. Again, I recommend looking at the pictures to have a better idea of what the Mishnah is referring to. The Rab does tell us, Ven halakha Rabbi Yehuda, the halakha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. Whoever would have the opportunity to look at the Rab expounds upon Erev Shabbat, on Shabbat, the reasonings behind it, the Rambam's explanation, how to read the Mishnah, different understandings. We follow the simple understanding of the Rab. That is the end of Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.